My name is Dior. I'm 37 years old. My father called me the loser in front of 40 relatives at our family reunion. He said it standing at the head of a long folding table under the pecan trees behind my aunt's house, a plate of ribs in one hand, his voice pitched to carry across the whole yard. "I'm proud of all my children," he said, raising his glass toward my brother Marcus first, then toward Renee, "except the loser," and he nodded, almost casually, in my direction, the way a man gestures at a piece of furniture he's grown tired of explaining. I thought that would be the worst thing anyone said to me that afternoon. I was wrong. Because 6 minutes later, in front of that same crowd, I set a folder down on the table beside his plate, 12 years of bank statements, $340,000 unaccounted for, and a signature that wasn't mine, forged onto a withdrawal form 4 separate times. None of them knew, standing under those pecan trees, that I'd been quietly pulling those statements for the better part of a year. Ever since a routine audit at my own firm had trained my eye to notice exactly the kind of gaps my father had spent over a decade hoping no one in this family would ever think to look for. I didn't know it yet, but the next time my father raised a glass at a family gathering, it wouldn't be to toast anyone at all. Welcome back to the channel, where we tell the stories about the families that mistake silence for peace, and about what happens when the person everyone underestimated finally stops staying quiet. We talk about legacy and about what it actually costs to protect one. If tonight's story sounds like something from your own family, tell me in the comments and stay, because what was actually inside that folder wasn't the only secret that came out at that reunion. Let me take you back to the spring before that summer, because none of what happened on that lawn makes sense without it. I grew up in Savannah in a house where my father's love operated like a ledger nobody else was allowed to read. He ran a modest, but well-regarded insurance brokerage for 30 years, the kind of business that let him be, in our extended family, something closer to a patriarch than simply a father, the man who co-signed loans for cousins, who quietly covered a nephew's tuition gap one semester without ever mentioning it again, who had, since before I was born, served as trustee of a family trust my grandfather had established, meant to fund education and emergencies for every grandchild in the family, evenly for generations. That trust was the one subject in our house that operated on a different register than everything else, spoken of reverently, rarely discussed in detail, entirely managed by my father, who reported on it to no one but himself. My mother, Yvonne, occupied a strange position in relation to all of it. She loved my father in the specific, practiced way of a woman who had decided, decades earlier, that peace was worth more than particular kinds of honesty. She rarely asked him direct questions about money. When she did, she accepted his answers the way you accept weather, inevitable, not worth arguing with. I was the middle child, between Marcus, 4 years older, and Renee, 3 years younger, and from an early age I understood, without anyone explaining it to me directly, that my father's favor moved through our house unevenly. Marcus got the trust disbursement for his MBA without a single question asked. Renee got hers for a wedding that, in retrospect, cost considerably more than any of us understood at the time. When my turn came, at 26, needing help with a down payment on my first apartment after a divorce that had cost me more than I'd expected, my father told me the trust was running lean that quarter and suggested I be patient, the way responsible people are. I was patient. I want to be honest about that, because it matters for everything that follows. I didn't push. I told myself the trust simply worked in mysterious, generational ways I wasn't positioned to fully understand, the same story my whole family had been quietly telling itself for decades. That was the first thing I chose not to look at directly. It would not be the last, and its cost would take me over a decade to fully understand. I built a career in forensic accounting almost by accident, a temp job out of college that turned into a specialty, then a reputation. Then a partner track position at a firm in Savannah that handled exactly the kind of internal fraud cases most people never think much about until they're the ones affected. I want to note the irony plainly, because it matters. I spent my entire adult career learning to read the exact patterns of concealment that would eventually undo my own father's management of a fund I'd been taught, since childhood, never to question. The spring before that reunion, my firm brought me onto an audit for a regional credit union unrelated to my family entirely, a case involving a trustee who'd been quietly skimming disbursements from a scholarship endowment for nearly a decade. Using a pattern so specific it became, almost immediately, familiar to me in a way I couldn't initially place. Small, irregular withdrawals timed just after quarterly disbursement cycles, always slightly below the threshold that would trigger automatic review, always justified afterward with a vague administrative note. I remember sitting at my desk that April, running the credit union numbers, feeling a cold, specific unease creep up the back of my neck that had nothing to do with the case in front of me at all. That night, I opened the one document my father had ever shared with our family regarding the trust, an annual summary letter he sent each January, 3 paragraphs long, reassuring, entirely lacking in the kind of itemized detail any actual fiduciary statement would contain. I'd received 12 of these letters over the years. I had never once, until that April night, actually compared them side by side. Laid out together, the pattern was unmistakable to anyone trained to see it. The trust's reported balance had grown steadily every year, modestly, believably, the exact rate a conservative fund might be expected to grow. But the disbursements listed for Marcus's MBA and Renee's wedding, cross-referenced against dates I remembered independently, didn't quite align with the balance my father claimed remained afterward. The numbers worked, technically, on paper. They simply didn't work the way real money actually moves. I sat with that unease for almost 3 weeks before I did anything about it. I told myself I was imagining a pattern that wasn't there, applying professional suspicion to a family situation that deserved better than my occupational cynicism. That was the second time I chose not to look directly at something that didn't fit, and I want to be honest that this hesitation wasn't ignorance. It was fear, dressed up as respect for a father I'd spent my whole life needing to believe was fundamentally decent, even when the evidence in front of me was starting to suggest otherwise. If you've ever built your entire understanding of a parent around a story you needed to be true, rather than one the evidence actually supported, you already know exactly the particular vertigo I felt that spring. Sitting at my kitchen table at 11 at night with 12 years of letters spread out in front of me like a hand of cards I'd been dealt and had never once thought to actually read. In May, I finally did something concrete about it. I drove to the county clerk's office on my lunch break and requested public records related to the trust's original filing, not because I expected to find anything definitive there, but because it was the smallest, safest first step I could take that still counted as actually looking. What I found wasn't proof of anything. It was, instead, a single detail that reframed everything. The trust, as originally filed by my grandfather, had named not just my father as sole trustee, but a co-trustee, his younger brother, my uncle Cornelius, who had died 11 years earlier, quietly of a heart attack at 61. I had never once, in my entire life, heard my father mention that Cornelius had ever held any formal role in managing that trust. Not once, at any family dinner, at any funeral, at any reunion under those same pecan trees where Cornelius himself used to sit every August until the year he simply didn't anymore. I didn't know it yet, sitting in that clerk's office parking lot with a certified copy of a filing document trembling slightly in my hands, that my uncle's quiet, unexplained removal from that paperwork, sometime in the 2 years before his death, was about to become the first thread in a pattern that would take me the rest of that summer to fully unravel, and that the person who would eventually help me understand exactly what happened to him wasn't going to be anyone I expected. I didn't tell anyone about the clerk's office visit. Not my mother, not Renee, and certainly not my father, who called that same week to ask, with the kind of casual warmth he reserved for conversations he'd already decided the outcome of, whether I'd be at the reunion in August. I said I would. He said something about how proud he was of how I'd settled down since the divorce, a phrase that landed strangely given what I'd spent the previous week doing, and I let it pass without comment, the same reflex I'd been practicing my entire adult life. That was the pattern for most of May, small inconsistencies surfacing, and me filing each one away instead of pulling the thread. My mother mentioned, in passing, over a phone call about nothing in particular, that my father had been buried in paperwork for the trust that spring, more than usual, staying up late in his study with the door closed. Something she found mildly amusing rather than concerning. I asked what kind of paperwork. She said, "You know your father, he doesn't explain, he just does," in the same fond, resigned voice she'd used about him for as long as I could remember. I didn't push her further. I told myself there would be a better time to ask real questions, once I had something more concrete than a co-trustee's name on an 11-year-old filing. The first week of June, I requested my own credit report and financial history, an unremarkable, routine thing to do, except that I did it specifically to check something that had started nagging at me. Whether the down payment gap I'd been quietly resentful about for over a decade had ever actually been logged anywhere as a trust disbursement in my name, even one I'd never received. It had. A disbursement of $22,000, dated the same month I'd asked my father for help, appeared in an old tax document I still had archived from that year, money that had apparently been released from the trust on my behalf, and that I had never once seen, received, or been told existed. I sat with that fact for a long time before I did anything with it. Not confusion exactly, something colder, more precise, the specific stillness of a person realizing a story they'd carried for over a decade had never actually been true. I had spent 11 years quietly believing the trust had simply run lean the year I needed it. It hadn't run lean at all. My share had been paid out. It had simply never reached me. Something tightened in my chest reading that document that I couldn't fully name yet, not rage, not yet, something closer to the specific vertigo of understanding that an old, familiar disappointment had actually been a theft the entire time, dressed up as bad timing. I called Renee that same evening, testing the water carefully without revealing what I'd found. I asked her, casually, whether she remembered exactly how much her wedding disbursement had been. She answered without hesitation a specific number, $38,000, and then added, unprompted, something that snagged immediately. Dad handled all the paperwork on that one directly with the venue and the caterer. I never actually saw a check, if that's what you're asking. I asked why she'd think that was what I was asking. She went quiet for a beat too long before saying, "No reason." "Why are you asking about this now anyway?" That hesitation told me something important, though not yet what it fully meant. Renee had noticed something too, at some point, and had chosen, for reasons I didn't yet understand, not to pursue it either. If you've ever discovered that someone else in your family had quietly noticed the same wrongness you had, and said nothing, for reasons of their own, stay with me, because what Renee actually knew, and why she'd stayed silent, wasn't fully clear to me for another 6 weeks, and it wasn't the explanation I expected. The second week of June, I drove out to see my Uncle Cornelius's widow, my Aunt Patrice, who still lived in the same modest house outside Statesboro where she and my uncle had raised their 2 children, and who I hadn't spoken with at any real length since his funeral 11 years earlier. I told her I was doing some family research, a technically true statement that felt uncomfortably close to a lie the moment I said it out loud. She invited me in for sweet tea, and after some catching up, I asked her, as gently as I could manage, whether she remembered Cornelius ever being involved in managing the family trust. Her face changed in a way I hadn't anticipated, not surprise exactly. Something closer to old, careful grief finally being given permission to surface. "He was pushed out," she said, 2 years before he passed. "Your father told him the paperwork needed simplifying for tax purposes, that having 2 trustees was creating unnecessary complications with the accountant. Cornelius didn't fight it. He wasn't a fighter, not with your father. But it bothered him. He mentioned it to me more than once, in the last year of his life, that he thought something wasn't right, that the numbers your father showed him before he was removed didn't quite match what he remembered contributing years earlier." I asked her if Cornelius had ever written any of that down, kept any records of his own. She was quiet for a moment, then said something that opened an entirely new thread I hadn't anticipated. "There's a box in the attic. I never went through all of it after he died. Grief does strange things to what you're willing to look at. If you want to look yourselves, you're welcome to it. But Dior," she paused, studying me carefully, your father's not a cruel man. Whatever this is, I don't think it started as cruelty. That single sentence, he's not a cruel man, would return to me later, at the reunion itself, in a context I couldn't have anticipated sitting in that kitchen with a glass of sweet tea going warm in my hand. I know some of you already suspect where the real complexity in this story is hiding, and it isn't simply a man who decided to steal from his own children. Stay with me, because what I found in that attic box reframed something I thought I already fully understood. The box, when Patrice and I finally opened it together that same afternoon, contained 11 years of Cornelius's personal notes, handwritten ledgers, cross-referenced against the annual letters my father had sent the whole family, showing discrepancies going back to nearly the trust's founding, long before I was even born. But it also contained something else, a series of letters between Cornelius and my father from the year before Cornelius's removal, in which my father, in his own handwriting, admitted to having taken an early, unauthorized disbursement himself. Not maliciously, according to the letter, but during a period when his own brokerage had nearly failed, a fact I had never once heard mentioned in 37 years of family history. I understood something in that attic that went beyond what I'd assumed walking in. My father hadn't simply built a pattern of quiet theft from his own children out of greed. He'd started, apparently, out of desperation, protecting a business that would have collapsed otherwise, and had then spent over a decade unable to find a way to stop, or confess, or repay what he'd taken, using each subsequent generation's disbursement to quietly cover the gap the previous one had left. I photographed every page in that box before I left, and I put the box back exactly where Patrice and I had found it, in the same corner of the attic, because I understood, standing there, that I wasn't ready yet to decide what to do with what I now held, and because some part of me, even then, wanted to give myself one more chance to be wrong about all of it. I didn't tell my mother. I didn't tell Renee the full truth, not yet, though I understood by then that whatever she'd noticed about her own wedding disbursement was very likely a smaller, more personal version of exactly what I'd just found in that attic. The last week of June, I finally pulled 12 years of the trust's actual bank statements myself, using access I had, through my firm's licensing, to request records under a limited family financial review authorization. Cornelius's original co-trustee filing had technically never revoked, a legal detail I suspect my father had never once considered might still exist, 11 years after quietly removing his brother's name from the paperwork. The statements confirmed everything the letters had implied, and added something new and considerably worse, for separate withdrawal forms, spanning the previous 6 years, each bearing a signature meant to be mine, authorizing disbursements from what should have been my own share of the trust that I had never once signed, in a hand that only vaguely resembled my own. I sat in my car outside the bank's records office for a long time after printing those 4 pages, hands not entirely steady, understanding that whatever this had started as, 11 years ago, in a moment of genuine desperation, it had continued for reasons that no longer had anything to do with saving a struggling business. It had continued because it was easier than ever admitting, to any of us, what he'd already done. I didn't confront him that week. I didn't tell anyone what I'd found. I drove home, locked the printed statements and Cornelius's photographed letters into a fireproof file box in my closet, and sat with the specific, cold clarity of understanding that I now held, alone, more of my own family's real history than either of my siblings, my mother, or my father believed any of us possessed. I didn't know it yet, but the reunion was 7 weeks away, and by the time I sat down at that folding table under the pecan trees, I would be holding not just 12 years of evidence, but a decision I hadn't yet let myself fully make, about whether to use any of it at all, or whether, like Cornelius before me, I would simply let this family's oldest, most comfortable lie continue exactly the way it always had. July arrived thick and humid, the particular Savannah heat that makes everyone move a half step slower, and I spent most of it running on the specific, private tension of a person carrying a secret that had teeth. I didn't sleep well that month. I want to describe that plainly rather than dress it up. I'd wake at 2, 3 in the morning, and lie there running the arithmetic of what I'd found: 4 forged signatures, 11 years of quiet theft. A brother pushed out of his own trusteeship for noticing exactly what I'd just confirmed myself. My appetite thinned. I'd catch myself at my desk, staring at a client file for whole minutes without reading a single line of it. The first week of July, Renee called me, unprompted, sounding strange in a way I couldn't immediately place. "I need to tell you something," she said, "and I need you to not tell Mom or Marcus yet." I felt my whole body go still, bracing for a version of what I already knew. What she actually told me reframed the shape of the story in a direction I hadn't anticipated. "My wedding," she said. "The disbursement. I found out 2 years ago it was smaller than what Dad told the rest of the family it was." I confronted him. He told me the difference had gone to cover administrative costs on the trust that year, and he asked me not to mention it to you or Marcus, because he didn't want either of you thinking your own disbursements might be affected too. I asked her why she'd agreed to that. She was quiet for a long moment. "Because he cried, Dior. He actually cried, telling me. He said the trust had taken a hit from bad investments the year before, that he was doing everything he could to protect all of us from having to know how bad it had gotten." I believed him. I've felt sick about it every day since, watching you not get your down payment help and thinking I knew something that might explain it, and saying nothing. That was the first genuinely misleading piece of information that reframed my suspicion that summer. For several days after that call, I found myself half believing my father's crime might actually be smaller and sadder than what I'd found in Cornelius's attic box, a man in real financial distress, quietly reallocating funds during a genuine crisis, hiding it out of shame rather than greed. Exactly the story Renee had been given and had chosen, out of love, to protect. I want to be honest that I almost let that softer story stand. For nearly 2 weeks in early July, I found myself constructing a version of events where my father's forgery of my signature might have been a single desperate act during one bad year, rather than a sustained pattern, where the 4 withdrawal forms I'd found might have a more forgivable explanation I simply hadn't uncovered yet. That softer story collapsed the second week of July, when I finally cross-referenced the dates on those 4 forged withdrawals against my father's own brokerage's financial filings, which, as a licensed public business, were a matter of public record. His firm hadn't been in any documented distress during 3 of those 4 years. The withdrawals hadn't been emergency measures at all. They'd simply continued, well past whatever crisis had started them, because no one had ever stopped him, and because stopping himself would have required admitting what he'd already done. If it wasn't ongoing financial distress, then Renee's kinder explanation collapsed with it, and if that explanation collapsed, then whatever my father had told her 2 years ago, with actual tears in his eyes, hadn't been the whole truth at all. It had been a performance, calibrated precisely to keep one daughter quiet using guilt, while keeping another daughter, me, entirely in the dark by simply withholding my own disbursement and calling it bad timing. I know some of you have already lived a version of this, the moment a comforting family story collapses and you're left back where you started, except worse, because now you understand the comfort itself had been manufactured. Stay with me, because what happened next wasn't the confrontation. It was smaller than that, and it complicated things further before it clarified anything. The third week of July, I drove to see my brother Marcus, ostensibly for an unrelated reason, helping him prep some paperwork for his own business, and steered the conversation, carefully, toward his MBA disbursement. What he told me shifted my suspicion in an entirely new direction. "Actually," he said, "Dad didn't pay for that directly out of the trust the way everyone assumes. He took out a loan against the trust's assets and paid it back over 4 years. He told me at the time it was more tax efficient that way. I never thought much of it. A loan against the trust's assets. I hadn't seen anything in the bank statements I'd pulled that documented a formal loan structure, which meant either Marcus had been told something inaccurate, or there was a second set of paperwork I hadn't yet found, held somewhere other than the trust's primary bank records. For several days, my suspicions swung toward the possibility that my father hadn't been managing this alone at all, that there might be an accountant, a lawyer, someone facilitating a more sophisticated financial structure than a man simply forging his daughter's signature on a withdrawal form. I found myself, briefly, suspecting my father's longtime accountant, a quiet, precise man named Gerald Whitfield who had handled both the brokerage's books and, apparently, some portion of the trust's paperwork for over 20 years. I called Gerald's office under the pretense of a routine professional inquiry about record retention policies for family trusts and asked, carefully, whether he'd ever handled loan documentation connecting a family trust to an individual's education financing. He was cordial, professional, and entirely unhelpful in a way that felt, at the time, deliberately evasive. He cited client confidentiality, which was reasonable on its face, but which also meant I couldn't rule him out as either complicit or simply careful. That thread, Gerald as a possible co-conspirator, occupied nearly a full week of my attention before it collapsed as thoroughly as Renee's softer story had. I found the actual loan paperwork myself, buried in a box of old tax documents my mother still kept in the hall closet, documents she let me look through under the pretense of helping her organize old records for an unrelated reason. The loan had been real, exactly as Marcus described, structured properly, repaid in full, entirely separate from, and unrelated to, the forged withdrawals I'd already confirmed. Gerald Whitfield, it turned out, had done nothing wrong at all. He'd simply handled one legitimate piece of a much larger, mostly illegitimate picture, and his caution on the phone had been ordinary professional discretion, not evasion. I understood, finding that loan paperwork, something about how easily suspicion attaches itself to the nearest available shape once you've been burned by one collapsed explanation. I'd nearly convicted an innocent, uninvolved accountant in my own mind simply because his silence had resembled, for a week, the same silence I'd been chasing all summer. That brought my suspicion back, fully and finally, to where it had started, my father, alone, acting without a co-conspirator, using a genuine early crisis as the origin point for a pattern he'd simply never had the courage or the honesty to stop. The last week of July, 10 days before the reunion, I did something I hadn't planned to do and immediately understood the cost of. I nearly told my mother. We were alone in her kitchen, and she mentioned, almost idly, how proud she was that our family had weathered every storm over the decades, still close, still gathering every August under the same pecan trees. Something in me, hearing that particular pride, nearly cracked open. I got as far as saying, "Mom, there's something about the trust one need to tell you," before I stopped myself. She looked at me, waiting, and I watched her face, still hopeful, still unaware, still holding a version of our family's history that I was, in that moment, one sentence away from permanently altering. I told her it was nothing, that I'd misplaced some old paperwork of my own and gotten confused. She accepted that easily, the same trusting ease she'd extended my father for 4 decades, and I understood, walking out of that kitchen, exactly how much that single choice, pulling back at the very last second, was going to cost me in the days ahead. If I'd told her then, privately, gently, she might have had time to prepare. Because I didn't, whatever happened next was going to happen to her in public, at the same moment it happened to everyone else. If you've ever come within one sentence of changing everything and pulled back instead, you already understand exactly the particular weight I carried out of that kitchen, and exactly how much heavier that weight became once I understood there would be no private, gentle version of this left available to me. I spent the final week before the reunion assembling everything into a single folder: the forged withdrawal forms, Cornelius's letters, the bank statements, a 1-page summary written in the flattest, most documentary language I could manage. The same tone I'd use presenting evidence to a client rather than a father. I didn't decide, even then, exactly when or how I would use it. I only knew, driving to my aunt's house that August morning with the folder sitting on my passenger seat, that I was no longer willing to let this family's oldest, most comfortable life simply continue the way it always had. I didn't know it yet, pulling into that gravel driveway under the pecan trees, that my father would hand me the exact opening I needed less than an hour later, standing at the head of that folding table with a glass raised in his hand. And that neither of us had any idea, yet, that my mother was about to learn the truth about her husband at the exact same moment as everyone else. The morning of the reunion, Savannah sat under a sky so bright and cloudless it felt almost accusatory, the kind of light that makes it impossible to hide anything for long. I arrived early, before most of the extended family, and helped my aunt set up the folding tables under the pecan trees the way I'd helped every August for as long as I could remember, a task so familiar my hands performed it without any conscious direction, while the rest of me sat somewhere else entirely, running through the contents of the folder now zipped inside my bag. My mother arrived an hour later, in the pale yellow sundress she wore to every reunion, carrying a sweet potato pie she'd made from my grandmother's recipe, laughing at something my Aunt Patrice said as they crossed the lawn together. I watched the two of them for a moment, Patrice, who now knew everything I knew, and my mother, who knew nothing and felt something twist in my chest that had no clean name. Patrice caught my eye once, briefly, across the yard, and gave me the smallest possible nod, the kind of gesture that could mean almost anything to anyone else watching, but that told me, unmistakably, that she remembered our conversation in her kitchen and understood exactly what I might be carrying in that bag. I felt the weight of that nod settle into my stomach, not encouragement exactly, more like a woman who had lost her own husband to this family's silence, quietly acknowledging that someone, finally, might not let the silence continue. Renee arrived shortly after and found me near the drinks table, her face doing the specific, complicated thing faces do when someone is trying to read another person's mood without asking directly. "Did you figure out whatever you were looking into?" she asked, low enough that no one else could hear. I told her I had. She asked if it was bad. I told her it was worse than what she'd been told, and watched something in her expression go pale and still. "Today?" she asked. "You're going to do something today?" I told her I didn't know yet. That was true. I genuinely hadn't decided, walking toward that folding table with my bag over my shoulder, exactly how or when I intended to use what I was carrying. Marcus arrived last, jovial and loud in the way he always was at these gatherings, greeting cousins by name, complimenting someone's new car in the driveway. Moving through the crowd with the easy confidence of a man who had never once had reason to wonder whether his own place in this family was secure. The afternoon proceeded the way these afternoons always had: plates of ribs and potato salad, children running between the pecan trees, my uncle's old boombox playing the same mix of gospel and Motown someone dug out every year without fail. I found myself, more than once, nearly forgetting what I was carrying, lulled by the specific, practiced comfort of a family ritual that had repeated itself so many times it had worn smooth grooves into all of us. That was the last hour I spent, in this entire story, still fully belonging to the family I'd grown up believing I had. I didn't know it yet, sitting at that table with a plate of ribs going cold in front of me, but everything after the next 15 minutes would belong to a different, truer version of us. It happened the way these things often do, not building toward drama, but arriving out of an entirely ordinary moment. My father stood, glass in hand, to make the toast he made every year, the one where he went around naming each of his children and something he was proud of that year. It was tradition. Everyone expected it. I'd sat through it every August for 37 years. He named Marcus first, his business expanding. A new contract landed that spring, and the crowd offered easy applause. He named Renee next, her promotion at the hospital, her steady, well-liked presence in the family, more applause, warmer, genuine. Then he turned toward me, and something in his face shifted into the particular expression I'd cataloged my entire childhood without ever having language for it, not quite contempt. Something closer to a man performing disappointment, because it was easier than performing anything more complicated. "I'm proud of all my children," he said, raising his glass toward the crowd, "except the loser." He said it almost lightly, the way you'd deliver a joke you'd told so many times it had stopped feeling like an insult to you, even though it never once stopped landing as one to me. A few relatives laughed, the specific, uncomfortable laughter of people who'd learned, over the years, that objecting to my father's humor cost more than simply going along with it. I felt something in me go very still and very clear, the particular calm that arrives, I've since learned, not from an absence of feeling, but from the sheer volume of it finally organizing itself into a single, coherent direction. I stood up. I didn't raise my voice. I reached into my bag, retrieved the folder, and walked the length of that folding table until I was standing directly beside him, close enough that the whole gathering under those pecan trees fell into the specific silence of 40 people realizing, all at once, that whatever was about to happen wasn't part of the usual script. I set the folder down on the table beside his plate, unopened. "You're right that one of us has been lying to this family for over a decade," I said, my voice even, carrying just far enough. "It isn't me." He looked at the folder, then at me, and I watched something flicker behind his eyes, not confusion. Recognition, arriving faster than I expected, the specific look of a man realizing, in real time, that whatever he'd spent 11 years managing had just run out of road. "Dior," he said, his voice dropping into something gentler, more careful than I'd heard from him in years. "Whatever you think you found, this isn't the place." "It's exactly the place," I said. "You made it the place. You've been making this the place every August for as long as I can remember." He told me, much later, what had gone through him in that exact moment, standing at the head of that table, the version I only understood once he was finally willing to say it out loud, months afterward. I saw the folder land on the table and I understood, before I'd even opened it, exactly what was inside it. I'd spent 11 years telling myself I still had time to fix it quietly, to pay it back before anyone noticed, the way you tell yourself there's still time to turn a car around before you understand you've already missed the exit by miles. Standing there, glass still in my hand, I felt something collapse that I'd been holding up by sheer will for over a decade, not just the secret, but the version of myself I'd needed to believe I still was, a good provider, a fair father. A man who'd made one mistake and contained it. I understood, in that instant, that I had never contained anything. I had simply gotten away with it, one reunion at a time, for 11 years, and calling my own daughter a loser in front of the whole family had been, in its own ugly way, insurance, if she was already the family's disappointment. No one would believe whatever she eventually found. I didn't open the folder myself. I didn't need to. My mother, standing a few feet away with her sweet potato pie still in her hands, set it down slowly on the nearest table and walked toward us, her face already changing in a way that told me she understood, without a single word yet spoken. That whatever this was, it was going to reorganize everything she believed about the man she'd spent 43 years married to. She reached the folder before he could stop her. She opened it. "I know some of you already sense that this is the moment everything in this story converges. Stay with me, because what happened in the next several minutes under those pecan trees, in front of 40 relatives, was not the confrontation any of us had expected, and it did not go the way my father, standing there with his glass still half raised, believed it would." My mother read the first page, then the second. I watched her hands, holding those printed bank statements, go completely steady in a way that felt more frightening than if they'd shaken, the specific stillness of a woman doing arithmetic she'd never let herself do before. 43 years of small inconsistencies suddenly resolving into a single, unbearable sum. She looked up at my father. She didn't say anything at all, not yet. But something in her face made him go still in a way I had never once seen from him in my entire life. The particular expression of a man realizing that the person he had most needed to keep from ever seeing the full picture was standing directly in front of him, holding it in both hands. I didn't know it yet, watching my mother's face in that silence, that the next 15 minutes at that reunion table were about to unfold in a direction none of us, not my father, not Renee, not even I, holding the folder that had started it, could have fully anticipated. The silence after my mother closed that folder lasted long enough that I heard, with strange clarity, a lawnmower somewhere down the street, a dog barking 2 yards over. The ordinary sounds of a Saturday continuing obliviously around the exact center of my family's unraveling. My father set his glass down on the table, carefully, the way a man sets something down when he's no longer certain his hand will hold it steady. "Yvonne," he said, "let me explain." "You've had 11 years to explain," I said, before he could finish. My voice stayed level, though I felt something underneath it straining to break loose. "You explained it to Renee 2 years ago, with tears and a story about bad investments that wasn't true. You explained it to Marcus as a loan you'd already paid back, which was true, but which had nothing to do with what you actually did to the rest of the trust. You never once explained it to me, because you didn't need to. You just quietly decided my share didn't matter and let me believe, for 11 years, that I'd simply been unlucky. Some of what I said landed with visible force. He absorbed the first sentence, the second, and by the third, I watched him shift, not collapse, not yet, but recalibrate, the way I imagined he'd recalibrated with Renee 2 years earlier, searching for the angle that would redirect this. You want to talk about what I did, he said, turning slightly toward the gathered relatives, his voice finding some of its old authority again. Let's talk about what it cost me to hold this family together for 30 years. Every one of you came to me when you needed something: tuition, a wedding, a down payment, bail money for your cousin Terrence. One Christmas none of you remember, because I handled it quietly, the way I've handled everything quietly. So none of you ever had to feel the weight of what it actually takes to keep a family like this afloat. Some of what he said carried a genuine, complicated truth. He had, in fact, held this extended family together through more crises than I could count, in ways that had nothing to do with the trust at all. For one disorienting moment, I felt the old, familiar pull to soften, to concede the larger point in exchange for peace, the exact reflex that had let this go unexamined for 11 years in the first place. I caught it. I made myself catch it. You held this family together, I said, and you also forged my signature 4 times to cover money you took that should have been mine. Both of those things are true. One doesn't cancel the other out. He tried a different angle. Your uncle Cornelius understood the pressures of running a business in this family better than any of you. He never once made this into a spectacle. Patrice, standing near the edge of the gathered crowd, made a small sound, not quite a word, something closer to a breath taken in sharply, and I understood, hearing it, that my father had just made a mistake he hadn't intended to make. Invoking a dead man's silence, as though it had been generosity rather than the quiet grief of a man pushed out of his own family's trust for noticing exactly what I'd noticed. Cornelius didn't stay quiet because he understood, Patrice said, her voice carrying clearly across the yard, surprising everyone, including, I think, herself. He stayed quiet because you told him keeping 2 trustees was complicating the paperwork, and he trusted you, the way everyone in this family has always trusted you, and it ate at him every day for the rest of his life. He told me himself more than once that the numbers you showed him didn't add up. He just never had proof. She does. The crowd's attention, which had been split between my father and me, turned fully toward Patrice, then back to my father, and I watched something shift in the room's collective loyalty, small, but unmistakable, a family beginning, in real time, to reconsider a story it had accepted for over a decade. My father tried a third angle, quieter now, aimed not at the crowd but directly at me, his voice dropping into something almost tender. I know I've been hard on you, Dior. Harder than I should have been. Some of that. He paused, and for a moment I genuinely couldn't tell whether what came next would be manipulation or the first honest thing he'd said all afternoon. Some of that was guilt. It's easier to call someone a disappointment than to face what you've actually done to them. I understand that now, standing here. I don't expect you to believe that helps. It didn't fully land as manipulation, and it didn't fully land as honesty either. It sat in the uncomfortable space between both, and I felt the ground shift slightly under the confrontation I'd planned, not because I doubted what he'd done, but because some old, exhausted part of me recognized, for the first time in my adult life, a version of my father trying, imperfectly and too late, to actually see me. I didn't let that recognition become forgiveness. But I let myself register it, and I think that registering the fact that I didn't have to choose between fury and understanding, that both could sit in the same moment, was the thing that finally cracked something open in me that had been sealed shut since I was 26 years old, standing in his study being told the trust was running lean. Maybe that's true, I said. Maybe some of it was guilt. It still cost me a decade of believing I'd simply been unlucky when I'd actually been robbed. Guilt doesn't undo that. It just explains it. My mother spoke for the first time since opening the folder, her voice quiet, but carrying an authority I had genuinely never heard from her in 43 years of marriage. Desmond, she said. How much? Yvonne. How much? She repeated, and something in her tone made even Marcus, standing frozen near the edge of the table, take a half step back. Roughly 340,000, I answered for him, when he didn't. Across 11 years. I have the statements. My mother looked at the folder in her hands, then at my father, and something in her face settled into a stillness I understood, watching it as the specific expression of a woman deciding, in real time, that 43 years of accepted silence had just permanently ended, whatever came next. Marcus, who had said almost nothing throughout the entire confrontation, finally spoke, his voice unsteady in a way I'd never heard from him. Dad, is this true? My father didn't answer him directly. He looked instead at me and said, quietly, the sentence that ended whatever remained of his earlier redirections. I don't know how to undo 11 years, Dior. I genuinely don't. You can't, I said. But you can stop pretending it was smaller than it was, in front of the one person in this family who's finally holding the actual numbers. The relatives around that table had gone almost entirely silent by then, the specific silence of 40 people understanding they'd just watched their family's central, comfortable story collapse in the space of 10 minutes, replaced by something considerably less simple and considerably more true. I didn't know it yet, standing at that table with the folder now back in my hands, that the hardest part of that reunion wasn't the confrontation itself. It was the quiet, unfinished conversation still waiting for me with my mother, later that evening, once the relatives had gone home and the pecan trees had gone dark, the one where I'd have to decide, for the first time in my life, what it actually meant to watch someone I loved lose the version of her marriage she'd spent 4 decades believing in. The practical unwinding took most of the following year, though the emotional one took considerably longer, and I understood, by the time both had settled into something like their final shape, that the two timelines were never going to move at the same speed. My father retained a lawyer within the week, not to fight what I'd found, but to formalize a repayment structure, negotiated through my firm's referral to an independent trustee who took over management of what remained of the fund. He repaid, over the following 18 months, the full amount owed to me, with interest calculated at the rate a court would have assigned, a fact I noted with the same flat, documentary precision I'd used presenting the original evidence. He did not contest a single figure I'd brought to that table. There was, in the end, no fight left in him to contest with. He lost, in the months after that reunion, the thing that had mattered to him most for 3 decades, not the money itself, which he could repay, but the family's understanding of him as the patriarch who held everyone together without cost to anyone but himself. Cousins who had once deferred to him automatically began, quietly, to ask their own questions about old arrangements, old favors, old debts. He attended the following year's reunion, and the one after that, but never again at the head of the table, and never again with a glass raised toward any of us in the old, performing way. My mother separated from him 4 months after that August afternoon, not dramatically, not with the kind of public reckoning that had unfolded under the pecan trees, but quietly, in the specific, undramatic way she'd conducted most of her 43 years of marriage. She kept the house. She told me once, months later, that the hardest part hadn't been learning what he'd done with the money. It had been understanding how many small, earlier signs she'd chosen not to examine, for the exact same reasons I'd chosen not to examine my own for over a decade, because looking directly at them would have cost her a version of her life she wasn't ready to give up. Renee and I grew closer in the aftermath, though it took real, deliberate work on both our parts. She carried genuine guilt over the 2 years she'd stayed silent about her own disbursement, and I had to learn, slowly, that her silence had come from the same fear that had kept me quiet for over a decade, not from any real disloyalty to me. We are, now, considerably more honest with each other than either of us had been before that reunion, a change neither of us takes for granted. Marcus, for his part, faced the smallest reckoning of anyone in the family, since his own disbursement had been legitimate and properly structured. But he lost something too, the easy, unexamined confidence of a man who had never once had reason to wonder whether his father's version of events was the whole story. I think that loss, quieter than mine, cost him more than he's ever said out loud. The quiet scene came the following spring, at Cornelius's grave, where I drove alone one Sunday afternoon with a copy of the final settlement paperwork folded in my coat pocket. I stood there for a long time without saying anything at all, understanding that the numbers I'd finally forced into the light had started, in some sense, with a man who'd noticed the same wrongness I eventually noticed and who had never had the proof, or perhaps the courage, to do what I'd finally done. I set the folded paperwork down at the base of his headstone, briefly, before picking it back up, a gesture that meant nothing to anyone but me, a way of telling a dead man that someone had finally finished what he'd started, quietly. 11 years too late for it to have mattered to him directly, but not too late to matter to the rest of us. I still wonder, sometimes, whether my father's guilt over how he'd treated me all those years had been genuine remorse arriving too late, or simply the most convenient explanation available to him once the numbers left him nowhere else to stand. I don't know that I'll ever fully know the difference, and I've made a kind of peace with that uncertainty that I couldn't have imagined making, standing at that folding table with a folder trembling slightly in my hands. That's my story. Thank you for sitting with me through all of it. It took me longer than I expected to be able to tell it without my hands going cold the way they did under those pecan trees. If any part of this found something familiar in your own family, I'd genuinely love to hear it in the comments. See you in the next one. What Desmond never understood was that the story he needed everyone to believe about himself, provider, patriarch, the man who carried the family's weight so no one else had to, was never actually incompatible with the truth. It simply required him to admit that carrying weight and stealing from the people beneath it could be the same set of hands, and that admission was the one thing his entire self-image had been built to avoid. This story isn't really about a family reunion, even though that's the scene everyone will remember. It's about autonomy, specifically, what happens when a family's financial and emotional architecture gets built entirely around one person's discretion, with no real mechanism for anyone else to verify what they're being told. Desmond never saw himself as a man who'd robbed his own daughter for over a decade. In his own account, delivered under those pecan trees, he was a man who had carried impossible weight quietly, protecting everyone from a crisis they never had to feel. That doesn't excuse 11 years of forged signatures. But it explains something true about how financial betrayal inside families rarely announces itself as theft. It announces itself as management, and management can curdle into theft so gradually that the person doing it convinces himself, for years, that he's still simply protecting people. What's harder to sit with is how differently each family member's complicity actually functioned, once examined closely. Renee's silence came from a manipulated grief, a genuine, tearful story she was given and chose to protect out of love, at real cost to her own sister. Cornelius's silence came from something older and sadder, a man who saw the pattern clearly and simply lacked the proof, or the standing, to challenge a brother who had already decided the story would be told his way. Neither of those silences deserves the same weight as Desmond's original theft, but neither of them was costless either, and the story doesn't ask them to be judged identically. One kind of silence protects out of love. Another kind of silence protects out of fear. Both, in this family, ended up protecting the same lie. Dior's own arc carries the real weight of what this story is actually about, though, because her flaw wasn't blindness to what was happening around her, it was a lifelong habit of noticing something that didn't fit and deciding, deliberately, not to look closer. Because looking closer would have cost her a version of her father she still needed to believe in. That flaw shaped more than one crucial moment, the 11 years she spent believing the trust had simply run lean, and the almost confession to her mother in that kitchen, pulled back at the last second. A choice that meant her mother would eventually learn everything in the most public, least gentle way possible. The story's real turning point isn't the reunion confrontation itself, that simply delivered what had already become inevitable. The turning point is smaller and earlier, the night at her kitchen table with 12 years of letters spread out, when she finally let herself compare what she'd been told against what the numbers actually showed. Instead of accepting the story because it was easier than the alternative. There's a version of this family where nothing changes, where Cornelius's suspicion dies with him, where Renee carries her guilt alone forever, where Dior spends the rest of her life quietly believing she was simply the family's unlucky child. That version doesn't end in anyone's ruin. It just continues, the silence inherited, the numbers never checked, the story never disturbed. What actually changed wasn't the money itself, though the money mattered. What changed was that one woman finally trusted her own trained eye over a family's comfortable, unexamined story and refused to let anyone else decide, on her behalf, what she was and wasn't allowed to know about her own life. Maybe that's worth sitting with longest, not the folder on the table everyone will remember, but the quieter question underneath it. How many family stories stay intact not because they're true, but because no one in the room has ever actually checked the numbers?